What if the most dangerous threat to Microsoft's dominance wasn't built by Google, wasn't funded by Apple, and wasn't launched by some Silicon Valley startup with billions in venture capital? What if the thing that could quietly pull hundreds of millions of users away from Windows forever was built by someone sitting inside Microsoft's own walls, someone drawing a Microsoft paycheck, using Microsoft tools, working in a Microsoft office, and they built it on Linux? Not as a rebellion, not as a protest, but just because they could. And right now it's spreading faster than anyone expected. This is the story nobody inside the tech industry wants to tell. There's a crisis unfolding in the personal computing world right now, and most people don't even realize they're standing in the middle of it. It is not a hack. It is not a data breach. It is not a corporate scandal. It is something far quieter, far slower, and ultimately far more consequential than any of those things. It is the beginning of the end of Windows as the default operating system for the average person. And the first real signal that this shift has begun came not from a competitor's boardroom, but from a bedroom desk, somewhere inside the Microsoft ecosystem itself. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what October 14th, 2025 actually meant. On that date, Microsoft officially ended support for Windows 10. No more security patches, no more updates, no more protection from the growing number of cyber threats that target unpatched systems every single day. That sounds like a normal corporate lifecycle decision. Companies retire old software all the time. But here's what made this one different, and here's where the real story begins. According to analysis from Canalys, Microsoft's hardware requirements for Windows 11 effectively disqualified an estimated 240 million PCs from upgrading. Read that number again. 240 million machines, still working perfectly, still capable of running software, still sitting on desks in homes and schools and small businesses around the world, suddenly stranded. And not because they were broken, not because they were slow, but because Microsoft decided they didn't meet a checklist that included things like TPM2. 0 chips and specific CPU generations that the vast majority of older computers simply don't have. Think about what that means for the average person. You bought a laptop 5 or 6 years ago. It runs fine. You use it every day. You browse the internet, you write documents, you video call your family, and then one morning you wake up to find out that your computer is now officially on its own, that the company that sold you the operating system has decided your hardware isn't good enough to continue receiving protection, and that your only options are to spend money on a new PC, pay for Microsoft's extended security update program, or figure out something else entirely. For hundreds of millions of people, that something else was suddenly not a hypothetical. It was an urgent reality, and that is precisely the environment into which AnduinOS arrived. But here's where it gets interesting, because AnduinOS isn't just another Linux distribution. The Linux world has had Windows lookalikes before. There's ZorinOS, which tries to mimic older versions of Windows. There's Linux Mint, which gives you something familiar. There are dozens of distributions that attempt to lower the barrier between Windows and open source computing. Most of them fail to make a significant cultural dent because they ask too much of the user. They require you to rewire your instincts. They put familiar concepts in unfamiliar places. They make you feel like you're learning something new when what you actually want is to just get your work done. AnduinOS is different. And the reason it's different is because of who built it and why. The creator of AnduinOS is Anduin, a Chinese software engineer who works at Microsoft, though not on the Windows team. And the project began as a deeply personal initiative, not as a corporate strategy or an industry statement. Xue is what the tech industry calls a software engineer 2, a mid-level role at one of the most powerful technology companies on the planet. He wasn't building AnduinOS to make headlines. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He was solving a problem he personally felt and probably watched people around him feel. The frustration of wanting a computing environment that felt like Windows without actually being Windows, with all the telemetry and the forced updates and the Microsoft account requirements and the advertising that has increasingly crept into the operating system, people pay good money to use. So he built one. And what he built was so precise, so thoughtfully designed, so carefully engineered to feel like home to a Windows user, that when the broader tech community found out who was behind it, the internet collectively paused. The project drew relatively little attention until AnduinOS 1. 3 was released and reviewed by NeoWin and DistroWatch, at which point Anduin stepped forward himself to explain who he was, including the fact that he was employed at Microsoft. And that single revelation changed everything about how people perceived this operating system. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a Linux enthusiast's weekend project. This was a Microsoft engineer publicly acknowledging that he had spent his personal time building the very thing his employer's operating system was supposed to prevent people from needing. The irony was almost too clean to be real, but it was real, and the tech world could not stop talking about it. Now, you might be tempted to dismiss this as a quirky story about a rogue engineer doing something slightly unexpected, but that instinct would cause you to miss the actual depth of what's happening here. Because AnduinOS isn't a novelty. It isn't a tech demo. It is a fully functional, actively maintained, increasingly sophisticated operating system that has already attracted a significant and growing user base. As of its most recent major release, AnduinOS ranks 11th in DistroWatch's page hit rankings over the last 6 months, a metric that measures how many people are actively researching and downloading a given Linux distribution. For a project maintained by a single person with no corporate backing, no marketing budget, and no investor funding, that is a remarkable achievement. 11th out of hundreds, and it is climbing. What makes AnduinOS work as an operating system is not just its appearance, though the appearance matters enormously for reasons we'll get to in a moment. It's the philosophy underneath the appearance. The latest release at the time of its public breakout, AnduinOS 1.3, was built on Ubuntu 25.04, launched in May 2025, giving it the rock-solid, battle-tested foundation of one of the world's most trusted Linux distributions, while layering on top of it a user experience that most Windows users would recognize within minutes of sitting down. The taskbar is at the bottom of the screen. The Start menu opens from the left. The icons look familiar. The window controls are in the right place. The system tray behaves the way you expect it to. None of these things sound revolutionary when you say them out loud, but for the hundreds of millions of people who have spent decades building muscle memory around the Windows interface, they are everything. AnduinOS ships with no data collection beyond what Ubuntu's base system requests, and even that can be declined during setup. There is no Microsoft account requirement for installation. Pause on that for a moment. In a world where Windows 11 increasingly nudges, and in some cases outright pressures, users into creating a Microsoft account just to complete setup, AnduinOS lets you install a fully functional Windows-like operating system on your computer without handing any personal information to any corporation whatsoever. For the millions of users who have watched Windows become less of a neutral tool and more of a platform for Microsoft to harvest behavioral data and serve targeted advertising, that distinction is not trivial. It is fundamental. One of the practical advantages of AnduinOS is its lean system requirements. It is less demanding than standard Ubuntu installations, requiring less disk space while still delivering a robust user experience. The official recommended specifications are a 2 GHz or better 64-bit processor, 4 GB of RAM, 20 GB of storage, and a screen resolution of 1024 by 768. In practical terms, this means AnduinOS can run comfortably on hardware that is close to a decade old. The very machines Microsoft's Windows 11 requirements locked out of the upgrade path are exactly the machines AnduinOS was designed to breathe new life into. This is not a coincidence. Anduin Sue understood perfectly well who his audience was going to be, because he was watching the same crisis unfold that everyone else in the tech industry was watching, and he had already built the solution before most people even recognized the problem. The software approach inside AnduinOS is also worth understanding carefully, because it reflects a set of deliberate, philosophically grounded decisions. Jouet made the choice to replace the default Snap package manager, a system that has drawn significant criticism from the Linux community for its performance overhead and centralized control, with optional Flatpak and app image support. This decision is particularly meaningful because it signals something about what kind of operating system AnduinOS is trying to be. It is not trying to be Ubuntu with cosmetic modifications. It is making substantive architectural choices that prioritize user experience, performance, and freedom over convenience for the distribution maintainer. And the Linux community noticed. Experienced users who would normally roll their eyes at yet another Windows-themed desktop environment actually had positive things to say about AnduinOS, because underneath the Windows aesthetic, there were genuine engineering decisions being made thoughtfully. And this is where everything changes, because there's a pattern in computing history that tells us something important about what happens when a technical solution reaches a tipping point of simplicity. The personal computer didn't take off because engineers loved it. It took off because ordinary people could suddenly use it. The smartphone didn't dominate computing because tech enthusiasts adopted it. It dominated because your grandmother could figure out how to use it. Linux has existed for over 30 years, has always been technically superior to Windows in many meaningful ways, has always been free, has always been more secure, and has always been more private. And yet, for 30 years, it remained a niche operating system used primarily by developers and enthusiasts. The reason is not technical. The reason is psychological. Linux looks and feels different, and different is scary when your livelihood, your creative work, your personal files, and your daily routine depend on a computing environment that just works the way you expect it to work. AnduinOS, almost by accident, is the most serious attempt yet to solve that psychological barrier. Not by teaching people Linux, not by asking them to change their behavior, not by asking them to learn terminal commands or understand package managers or reconfigure desktop environments. but by meeting them exactly where they are, by making Linux look so much like the thing they already know that the barrier to adoption shrinks from a wall to a speed bump. That is a genuinely significant innovation, even if it does not look like one on the surface. But let's talk about what the trajectory of this project actually looks like, because the version history of AnduinOS over the past year and a half tells a story of rapid, serious development. AnduinOS 1.4, built on top of Ubuntu 25. 10 introduced a new terminal called Pixis, updated to GNOME 49 and shipped with Linux kernel 6. 17 for improved system performance and security. These are not cosmetic updates. These are substantive engineering changes that improve the operating system at a deep technical level. The release also removed X11 in favor of Wayland as the sole display server, a modernization decision that even major Linux distributions have been cautious about making, reflecting a level of technical ambition that you would not expect from a one-person side project. And then came 1.4, 2, the most recent release, which added things like full codec support out of the box, updated audio drivers for newer Intel hardware, and a more reliable upgrade system with better error messaging. These are the kinds of quality of life improvements that tell you the developer is thinking not just about enthusiasts, but about real users who don't know how to troubleshoot when things go wrong. The roadmap beyond that is already public. AnduinOS 1.5 will be based on Ubuntu 26. 0.4 LTS, the long-term support release, arriving in April 2026. Long-term support means that the underlying Ubuntu base will receive security updates and maintenance for 5 years. That is not a small commitment. That is the kind of stability promise that organizations, schools, and businesses need before they can seriously consider adopting any operating system. The fact that AnduinOS is moving toward an LTS foundation means that Anduin Shui is not just thinking about individual users who want to keep their old laptops running. He is laying the groundwork for institutional adoption. And that is a much bigger story than one person's personal project. Think about what that means. If AnduinOS Starter 1. 5. LTS arrives in the spring of 2026 on a foundation that promises 5 years of security support with a Windows 11 interface that ordinary people can navigate without instruction, running on hardware that Windows 11 rejected, available completely free of charge with no telemetry, no account requirements, and no advertising. What exactly is the argument for a small business to continue paying Microsoft licensing fees for machines that Microsoft already declared obsolete? What is the argument for a school district that is operating on a tight budget to buy new hardware when the machines they already have can run a secure, maintained, functional operating system for free? The economic logic starts to shift in ways that, if you're paying attention inside Redmond, should be making someone very uncomfortable. Windows 11's hardware requirements fundamentally change the psychology of the upgrade cycle. The combination of TPM2, 0, secure boot, supported CPU lists, Microsoft account pressure during setup, and an increasingly cloud service-oriented posture made the new operating system feel less like a neutral continuation and more like a gatekeeper. That word, gatekeeper, is doing a lot of work. Because when users start perceiving an operating system not as a tool they control, but as a platform controlled by someone else that they merely have permission to use, the loyalty calculus changes. And Microsoft has been pushing users toward that perception steadily for the better part of a decade, through forced Windows 10 upgrades, through advertising in the Start menu, through Cortana integrations nobody asked for, through OneDrive prompts that appear every time you save a file, through account-linked features that make local use feel like a second-class experience. Every one of those decisions was made for legitimate business reasons from Microsoft's perspective. And every one of them has been eroding user trust in ways that are now becoming measurable. The trust deficit is real. And AnduinOS is, whether intentionally or not, positioned to absorb the users that trust deficit drives away. The privacy-conscious user who is exhausted by telemetry, the budget-conscious user whose hardware can't upgrade, the technically curious user who has been watching Linux improve for years and now finally sees a version that doesn't require them to sacrifice familiarity, the small business owner who is doing the math and realizing that free, functional, and secure is a better value proposition than expensive, bloated, and increasingly intrusive. These are not fringe users. These are mainstream users. And they are looking for exactly what AnduinOS is offering. What most analysts are not seeing in this story is how it fits into a much longer arc of platform power shifting. The history of computing is full of moments where the dominant platform seemed unassailable right up until the moment it wasn't. IBM dominated enterprise computing until it didn't. Internet Explorer had over 90% browser market share until it collapsed. BlackBerry owned the smartphone market until iOS arrived and made the interface so intuitive that the entire paradigm shifted overnight. And the disruptor always had one thing the incumbent couldn't replicate: a reason for users to care about switching that was more powerful than the friction of switching itself. AnduinOS has that reason. It is not asking users to switch because Linux is philosophically superior. It is not asking users to switch because open source is morally correct. It is asking users to switch because their computers still work, their software still runs, their files are still there, and there is a free operating system that looks exactly like what they're used to and will keep their machines safe for the next 5 years. That is a practical, economic, psychological argument that lands very differently from try Linux. It's actually pretty good. And the timing of that argument, arriving immediately after Microsoft forced 240 million users to make a decision about their computing future, is not an accident of history. It is a convergence. The downstream effects are still playing out and will continue to play out over the next several years. Users who made the switch to AnduinOS when Windows 10 reached end of life now find themselves navigating a well-maintained upgrade path, with the developer providing clear guidance and a dedicated upgrade command that transitions systems from one version to the next. That kind of continuity matters enormously for user retention. Every time AnduinOS successfully updates without drama, without data loss, without requiring a tech support call, it builds the kind of quiet confidence that turns cautious adopters into committed users, and committed users into people who recommend the operating system to others. Word of mouth in computing communities is extraordinarily powerful. One person who successfully migrated their aging laptop to AnduinOS and found that everything just worked will tell 5 more people. And those 5 will tell 5 more. And the ripple extends outward in ways that no marketing campaign can engineer. The broader Linux ecosystem is watching with a mixture of excitement and cautious realism. AnduinOS is not the first attempt to make Linux palatable for Windows users, and it will not be the last. But it may be the first one to arrive at exactly the right moment with exactly the right design philosophy, at exactly the right level of technical polish, to actually change the adoption curve in a meaningful way. The DistroWatch ranking is a signal. The growing media coverage is a signal. The fact that major technology publications from Tom's Hardware to ZDNet to NeoWin are writing substantive reviews of what was, 18 months ago, a completely unknown project. That is a signal. Signals are not certainties, but they are worth paying attention to. And here is the final uncomfortable question that this story leaves sitting in the air, unanswered and unresolved. If one engineer at Microsoft, working in his personal time with no budget and no team, can build a Linux distribution compelling enough to rank in the global top 15 and generate mainstream media coverage at the exact moment hundreds of millions of Windows users are being forced to reconsider their options, what happens when more engineers like him start doing the same thing? What happens when the community around AnduinOS grows large enough to take on the structural work that one person cannot do alone? What happens when AnduinOS 1, 5 LTS, arrives in April 2026, and a school district or a small business or a local government looks at its IT budget, looks at its aging hardware fleet, looks at a free, maintained, familiar, secure operating system, and makes a decision that Microsoft's own policies made inevitable? Nobody inside the tech industry is answering that question right now. And that silence, more than anything else, tells you exactly how significant this story actually is. Something is shifting. Something quiet and structural and deeply consequential. It started with one engineer, one personal project, one operating system nobody had heard of. And now, in the aftermath of the biggest forced migration event in the history of consumer computing, it is growing, slowly.